with Automation Hour.
Yeah, thank you. This is exciting to be here today, and exciting to showcase a fun use case that we have in our org. As you see on the side, I feel like I kind of do a bunch of different odd stuff in the Salesforce ecosystem. Some of the highlights would be actually working with Michelle on Midwest Dreaming. So if you want to come to the Twin Cities, where I reside, and learn that it's not always 5 degrees and snowy, and that it actually is really beautiful in July, come to Midwest Streaming. Kind of a fun little tidbit about myself is I was a part of the original admin keynote before it actually was labeled as an admin keynote. It was like kind of the inaugural year of it, and so I presented with that, which was a lot of fun. You can follow me on Twitter with Knickers Universe. I respond to Knickers, so feel free to ask questions to Knickers, and I will usually respond to them. So a bit about what I'm going to be doing today. I'm going to be talking about lead storing and kind of just doing an overview of what is lead storing. I want to assume that kind of a limited knowledge level of what lead storing is, and so I want to start there. Talk a bit about more the problem that we had at my organization, the University of Minnesota. Speak to a bit about some of the common solutions that exist out there, and then really get into the nitty gritty where we walk through the flow solution that I've built, and then have some time for questions. Feel free to, I have the chat up, then I think we'll be monitoring that throughout. So if there's questions that happen during, I'll happy to try to speak to those as we're going through this. So first, before we get any further, I want to describe what is a lead store. And so think of lead store as just a numerical value that you assign to a lead or a prospect. And really that stores that indicate the interest that they have in whatever the good or service that you're trying to sell. Everyone kind of has their own flavor of lead storing, and at the same time, there's some commonalities that you see across the different areas when people are trying to define, how do I get that numerical value? What makes someone a lead store of, say, 100 or 10 or whatever that value, numerical value may be, versus, say, a 0? Some of the common things would be engagement with the company. So are they actively working with you? Are they filling out forms? Are you talking with them? Things along those lines. Company information, maybe the size of the company, the number, the revenue, the employees, things along those lines. Other times would be maybe completeness of the record. Do you have the name and the email address and the phone number? Do you just know a name and you have no way to contact them? That might derive a different lead store if you have no way to contact them. That record may not be a good lead. Location is another one where maybe you're trying to target different markets or different regions, and so the score may be higher or lower based on the region that you're working with. And then recency. And so a recency would be, how recent is it, maybe did this lead come in? How recent have you engaged with them? Some of those types of characteristics are some of the criteria that can go into lead store. There's a lot of other ones that could exist out there, but these are some of the main ones that I've seen and some of the ones that we're doing in our org to debate with it. And so what I like to use as an analogy of choose your adventure with lead storing with everything in Salesforce. And this is another one of those that you can kind of choose your adventure, and that's a bit about the kind of excitement of lead storing. So let's transition over to a bit more about the problem that we had. And today's demo is actually showcasing a flow that is in a production org, but I'm not going to be not in the production org today, but we'll be kind of showcasing how it actually looks in production in a scratch org. But really, we had a department within our institution that was moving on to Salesforce. They were on another CRM that was doing a little bit of everything from their prospect management to email engagement and lead storing and marketing and all those different odds and ends. And they wanted to come to Salesforce, as that was where essentially that's where we were using for all the different departments. So they were kind of on their own little spoke, and we wanted to bring them into the hub that was Salesforce. That tool that they had lead storing that was native in it, and they really loved that logic. And actually kind of going back to whenever you're migrating from one department to another, or one org to another, or one instance to another, there's always this concept of, we got to have this, or it needs to do this, or how can we do X, Y, and Z? And that's where this lead storing became a gotta have. And so we had to figure out how to make that happen. The gotcha that we had in this situation was that within our institution, we have Marketing Cloud, and that's used across the entire university system. We've been told that we're kind of a snowflake in the number of business units that we have. We have hundreds of business units in our org. It's an older instance of Marketing Cloud. And so some of the native Salesforce integrations actually that we could do weren't coming into play with that. And at the same time, we had to think creatively because Marketing Cloud doesn't have lead scoring built into it out of the box. So we had to, that was a bit about the problem or what we were trying to resolve from there. So when we started to think about, okay, we need to solve lead scoring in the sphere of Salesforce and knowing that we need to solve the CRM side, but also solve for the Marketing Cloud side, my step one was to go to the App Exchange. Most of the times whenever I have a solution, I'm either going to Google or to the App Exchange to try to solve what's going on there. And ironically, there's a lot of solutions that exist out there, and there's a Salesforce lab that was rather interesting to us in twofold. A, it was free, and B, it was a Salesforce lab, which I'm always intrigued by when those come out. Where we ended up falling astray with that one or not working out as well as other apps would be that it was only focused solely on lead and campaign member criteria. We have a lot of our criteria is actually based on kind of engagement. So, calls that were logged, emails that were sent, things along those lines. And we just didn't have that lead scoring didn't have a way to do so. The other solution that we looked into for a minute was Pardot. Because we had Marketing Cloud, we went, well, maybe there's a use case where we could get Pardot for this department, and that would solve that department's need, and yet at the same time maybe create a better integration with Salesforce that we were kind of longing to have. And we ended up not going that route, mostly because of the paid route. We just had a limited budget, and we weren't able to fully utilize the tools on that paid feature or getting into a paid product that can do not just lead scoring and more. So that's where we had to stop and say, hey, let's rethink this. And then I had a kind of an idea of, well, Flow's getting pretty good. And this was about 2 years ago, and each release Flow's continuing to get better. But 2 years ago, it was kind of that light bulb moment for me. Hey, let's look at Flow. And so why we went the Flow route was, A, I could choose my adventure. I was allowed to pick and choose the criteria that I wanted. I could choose when it was going to fire, all those different items. I had my adventure set and forth of me, and I could write that story, write that book as much as I wanted. And so that's why we went to Flow and what led us to that route. So let's dig into a bit more about that Flow and talk about how does it work. And I want to try to today I'm going to try to break up the Flow apart into different pieces in terms of what were we doing, how is it working, what was the kind of the concept there, and even some of the roadblocks that we encountered. So before we get any further, here's a screenshot of the Flow in its entirety. And so it starts as a scheduled flow. We're getting some activity records, and then we have those records going through a loop, and you'll see some different assignments that are taking place. From there, we actually have even sub-assignments that are happening. And then there's kind of two sides. It's that part A of those activities. Part B is more of the kind of the lead demographics. And so company having assignments or decisions going on the company size, the title, the phone if we knew it, and then getting work our way farther over to the actual update from there. So that's the Flow in its entirety, but let's break this up into smaller chunks. And so what I want to kind of talk about here is we have the start. We're going to start with, today we're going to actually kind of I think I have 8 bullet points here. I'm going to kind of break apart each of these 8 bullet points together. So we'll have the start. We'll talk about how I have that get taking place. Talk about the activity sort, which I affectionately call the sorting hat. I'm a big Harry Potter fan, and so if you get the sorting hat reference, A+ to you for the day. And then those assignments. I have a separate item that because this is scheduled, we want it to work all the time, and so we wanted to account for those error exceptions, those lead demographics, and then at the end, actually, we're aggregating all that data together to then do that record update. So that's a bit more about kind of the different points that we're going to talk about today through this journey. So let's start with the start. That is the scheduled side of it. And so how this flow has been set up is that every night, 4:30 in the morning, we're going to grab a group of leads in our Salesforce instance and try to evaluate this criteria. When we started to think about, could we have this triggered on a record itself, or could we have it maybe trigger on activity records off of activity records, or even lead records? There's a couple ways avenues we could have went down. Ultimately, why we went the schedule route was that we wanted the ability to reevaluate that same record each day in a 30-day window, because there's some instances where maybe after 4 days, the reason I went to the recency, after maybe 4 days or 7 days, we want to look at that record in a more innate detail, versus say 30 days later, that record may get a score of 1 versus a 5 that was maybe the day before. So that's why we went the scheduled route. It also was just kind of like going back to choose your adventure. Scheduling a flow was something I had never done before, so I was curious by that idea. And so it checked all the boxes in terms of what we need to do and reevaluate the records, and at the same time allow me to learn something new with flow, which was very fun. How we have the initial start, we have the filter conditions to show only the records that have an activity in the last 30 days. Now this is where there's a got you that will appear, and I'm just going to go on to the next slide here, and that flow doesn't have the ability to use relative date fields. So the dream would be that you've been able to say last activity date, which is a standard field on flow, is greater than or equal to the last 30 days. That would be the dream scenario. But flow doesn't have that, and actually there's an idea that I have a link to the idea exchange. So this is an idea that you should vote early, vote often on that allow this to happen. But what I had to do to solve this was actually create a checkbox field on the lead record to basically check to say, does this lead record have an activity in the last 30 days? If it does, check that box. If it doesn't, don't check that box. And that, by having this field and using that in the criteria, that's going to narrow the number of lead records I have in my population to just the records that I want to evaluate the criteria for. So this is a speed bump that we learned really quickly when we were building this flow, but we're able to move past with that simple formula field. Continuing on here, we have a get. And as I mentioned before, there's kind of two parts of the flow. There's activity side and demographic side. We're using activities to not just track the logs and calls. We're actually have some integrations that are in place that are flowing in data from the website. So if someone fills out a form, there's an activity that gets logged to say that they submitted a form. Or in some cases, we're actually have integrations to state if someone opened or clicked the email, or even some instances where we have web visit activity flowing into Salesforce. And so we have some integrations that are in place to solve that. And I won't really speak too much about those integrations today, outside of saying that we had them. We chose activities just to have kind of a central place. There's definitely some use cases or hindsight where, hey, we could have probably split those into different objects just because of the volumes of records that could be created from those. But we ultimately decided one place, one-stop shop. Let's have activities be kind of the end-all be-all for engagement with the lead. And so we have a get with a bunch of a large or statement where we have basically say, hey, go find that lead that triggered that flow, excuse me, that scheduled flow, because with scheduling also I should mention that it runs for every record in the flow. And so kind of think of it as, say you have 100 records that meet that criteria, it's going to run each of those 100 records uniquely. And so we want to basically take that initial or one of those records and say, hey, go find any of the activities that are related to that one record that meet this criteria. And that's where kind of that or statement comes into play. Hey, meet any of these criteria, all these items from there. We wanted to also account for the situation that we may have a get where we have a record that may have no activity. And granted, it may seem counterintuitive because we have the last activity date as the criteria for the start. we really want to have a fail-safe just in case, just to make sure if there is no activities that were picked up, we want it to return. We want it to basically continue on and not just stop and not know what to do. And so we have a decision right after that get to just tell us, did it find activity or not? And so it's just saying, hey, activities is null, false. And then we can continue on. And the no activities, we basically just have it routed to continue on with the rest of the lead scoring, i.e. the demographics. But if it did find something, where a lot of our work is working from here is to actually use an activity loop. And so we're gonna say I found 3 different activities for that prospect that is in the scheduled flow. I'm gonna loop through each of those activities in here, and that's where we're using the collection variable of that initial get that we're using and sorting through each one of those. And this is where the flow kind of takes a little more complex end, but at the same time a fun item here where we're using an activity sort to kind of route the type of activity that may be, and not just the type of activity, but the recency of the activity. And I'll show in a moment here the lead scoring criteria that we're using, but there's a handful of situations where we may have a situation where we want to look at someone that clicked an email, say 3 days ago, differently than someone that clicked an email, say 14 days ago. And so we need to route those activities down different paths. And so that's where we were able to use the decision tree and basically route those different decisions based on not just the type of activity that we were having, but also the date that was taking place. This is just a quick slide to show you the lead scoring criteria that we were using. A lot of the items that we were working with were kind of going back to twofold: part demographics about the person, but a lot of it was about the engagement. And in a lot of situations, kind of going back to the system that they were on before, they had ability to link to track page views. If someone viewed the website recently, if someone submitted a form, if someone clicked an email. So there's a kind of this innate idea of are we able to track what is someone thinking, or how often is someone thinking about us, or how often is someone interacting with us that we can track in a kind of a big brother kind of a way, but we're able to know about what is going on because they're clicking and on different emails and different ideas from there. So that's just a bit more about the page lot or the lead scoring that we have and some of the items that we have here. And one thing I'll just quick mention of the form submissions, we have a 30-day and a 4-day. And so that's where we had to route to the different dates based on that. Because if they were a recent form submissions, they literally filled out a form earlier today, we want to give them a higher score as a result of that. Now that we have, and kind of going back to, okay, that's how we've routed the different activities and kind of eye on how do we translate that over to the assignment. What we were doing with each of those variables, or each of those activities rather, was to use the variable and make an assignment to store that value. So for variables, what we're doing with variables, kind of think of variables, I like to think of them just as like a container or a bucket of information. And so what we were able to do with each one of these was to create an assignment a variable and then assign the values based on what type it was from there. So here's kind of the variable that we were storing. Here's all the variables that we have. So there's a bunch of different variables that we're creating here. Kind of the joke is there's a variable for that. And so we just have a bunch of different containers that we're making assignments to say this is the for a form submission that was in the last 4 days, let's make sure that we mark that score as such. Down to the literal assignment side of it, what we're doing is, in the most situations, what we're doing with that variable is that we're just assigning it a static value. And so in this case, they opened an email, so we're going to give them a value of a 1. That's probably about 90% of the different assignments we have in here, where we're actually just saying, hey, here's a variable that we're wanting to assign a value to, and then work from there on it. The one situation that we do have is on page views, where if someone viewed multiple pages, we may want to add, kind of do a count of how many times did they view a page. And so we do have one assignment in which we're using variables and using the operator of the add to say for every occurrence in that loop. So kind of as it's going through that loop, every time it hits that, goes down that path and it finds a value that meets that criteria, it's going to add a little tick mark onto that variable until it's completed. And so that was a fun instance that we were able to utilize a different different element of assignments and kind of see how it can do one way versus another. And just kind of show you how we had with that one too, we were able to do the decisions to basically route, okay, once you have that page view count, let's do a decision on that to then route it. And maybe even some situations, in this situation particularly, we're doing an assignment to an assignment. As I'm talking through this, I think it would be a perfect time to circle back to the flow itself that we have here, just to kind of showcase, kind of go back to, okay, where are we at in the journey? And so just to kind of go back to the flow, as we're talking through this, we had that initial start, here's that get, here's that loop, and now we have those decisions to route off, and here's where all those assignments are to say, hey, assign a value of 1. In the situation we have with that page view, we're having that adding assignment is right here, and then once it completes with that loop, we're able to then assign those values up in the top here, where we have a secondary decision and from there. So that's a bit about the left-hand side of the activities. Maybe I'll pause at this point to see if there's any questions. I haven't seen anything in the chat, but just want to kind of see if there's any questions at the point so far.
We do have one question, Nick.
Ooh.
So I'm going to totally butcher the name. Is it Jurgis perhaps asked about the checkbox with the formula to check for today or in the last 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
Start the flow. How do you set that to true? Is it by another automation or do you do that manually?
We're doing that. Yeah, great question. We're doing that as a formula field. So there's we used to have a formula field on the lead object to create that. There's no automation behind it. It's just a formula field that takes place, and that's where the scheduling kind of in working in unison with our scheduling, it works out well because every night we're just grabbing those records. We don't have to reevaluate or have it if that value, if a record enters into that last 30 days and that checks to true, we're not having to trigger anything. The scheduled flow takes care of all that magic for us.
Perfect. As yet, that is the only question I have seen, so I think we're good to keep going.
Cool. Well, we'll keep on trucking here. One of the other items just to kind of mention in our flow journey was that with it being scheduled, we wanted to cover all of our bases. And this was also a chance for me to learn. When I've built flows before, I always saw that, after you've kind of connected on, say, a decision or on a get, you always, after you connect the lines, you realize, oh, there's another line that you can connect there. And that's the fault line. And what we wanted to make sure that we want to have kind of those error exceptions. And I think Michelle had a great analogy of this the other day where, say a toddler, and that's a very real example with 3 kids under 5 in our house, where you kind of have to let them know what they need to do in the journey. And so in the situation where they say, hey, do you want to, are you hungry? They may say yes or no. And instead of saying, do you want to eat? You need to basically probe them of, we're going to eat. And if you don't want to eat, we need to continue on from there. And so the concept here is we're always having to make sure we have a path for that person to go from there. I probably butchered that example, Melissa, but all I could think of was eating and our kids wanting to eat all the time. So they're asking when's it time to eat and having a path there. So the example may or not be as good as what you described earlier this weekend when we were talking, but the concept here is we want to make sure that if there's nothing for it to do, we want to continue on with the journey. We want to continue on with that flow to evaluate everything else. We don't just want it to stop and sit there waiting for us to figure out what they want to eat or get their food for them. The latter part of the flow here that we're doing, it's kind of the same concept as we had before, but each one of these have different decisions. And so what we wanted to do with the demographic information side is that we were having the company size, the title, and the phone number. Those are 3 values that we wanted to make sure that if those are known or meet certain criteria, that we wanted to assign a value to kind of give them another little tick mark to say, hey, this is a lead that we should follow up with. More than someone else that maybe doesn't have one of these. And so each one of these have a very similar idea where we're taking that decision, following it through to say, hey, is the company size greater than X? Is the title equal X, Y, and Z? Is the phone number, is it populated? And if so, another one of those assignment with a variable for each one of these that assign a value, and then a value of 1 for each one of these. So then we have information from there. So that's a bit more about the demographic information. This is kind of show you a little bit more of those details. So here's our example. We specifically wanted to look at if someone had a company with more than 100 employees to give them that check mark. And so we have a decision to say, hey, take those 100 employees, or if their lead record shows that they have more than 100 employees at that company, mark or continue on. Otherwise, go back and evaluate the next criteria. And then here's that assignment. And so we have another variable here for company size score equals 1, and being able to set that value to equals. Now this is where kind of the aggregation happens. Going back to, there's a couple of ways we probably could have done this, and you could have had a way where, each in that flow, maybe each time that you hit that assignment, you could have added had it be the same variable and assign it as 1. We went the route on our end of showing our work, and that's why we went of each kind of idea or each criteria had its own lead score. We chose to go that route, and what we were able to do then with that is we could show our work for 1, but B, we were able to create another variable and use a formula variable to calculate, to kind of add all those fields together. And so here's that calculate lead score page where we have all 12 of the lead scores here, where we basically say, hey, this score, add this score, add this score, add this score, add this score. So we continue on that journey of adding each of these scores into one. And so then you have, you're showing your work and you can kind of debug. It helped us a lot with debugging. Hey, this value isn't getting assigned. Okay, we have to go back and figure out why that value is not getting assigned, versus having to go through and actually look at that tick mark. Was it adding that tick mark? And so we were able to debug a little bit easier by having it split up like this. And 2, we were able to then have it into a step that we could break it up a bit more. The other item that we noticed after, so we went live with this and it worked out really well, those different steps. So where we got into a little bit more of a issue was every night, say we have, say, 2,000 lead records in our instance that met the criteria. Every night it would update all 2,000 of those records, regardless of if the score was updated. And we started running into limits within our org that was because those records were getting updated, and we're triggering other automation that may or not needed to get fired because, say, the lead score was 5 the day before and it got updated and it was still 5. And what we were running into is, so say 75% of those records, they were firing and there was no change to that record, but because we were doing a record update, it was triggering another automation, and the errors upon errors were coming in. We were running into the SQL limits of 100 was a common error that we were running into, where it can only kind of vet through 100 records in a query. And we also have in our org, we have a managed package that does a lot of heavy lifting on a record update, and we were running into barriers with that as well, and errors over there. So those are some of the 2 things that we ran into right away after we went live. and quickly, the route that we went, there's a couple ways that we could have solved this in flow. One of those is you can add in a pause step for it to pause, basically, and that kind of resets all those limits before continuing. But we went this route of having the decision to say, is the score that's already on that record, does it not equal the formula that we just calculated? And is it different or not? And if it's different, we want to continue with this update. If it's not different, let's just stop. We don't need to trigger that update. We don't need to continue on with it. And so that was another step that we added in, probably about actually a week in to having this flow, just because those nightly limits weren't really fun for us. So this was really a lifesaver. And since we've added this in, we literally haven't had to touch the flow now for a better portion of a year. Once we have that decision, we have one final assignment that we want to do, and we're using the assignment variable here. Kind of going back to using assignments are really powerful in flow. And I'm so flow now, so I can't fully probably articulate this in a good way, but you're able to assign values to that flow, actually to that record, and then you're able to do a fast update on that record. So that record kind of does those in a batch a lot easier, and kind of the processing side of flows works a lot more efficient. And so we have one final assignment here to say, hey, set the lead score to be this calculated lead score variable that we're holding in to the process here. Once we have that assignment, we have a record update where we're just saying, hey, take that record that it started this flow on that schedule, mark that record and update that record and continue on in that schedule where, say there's 100 records, it'll do one, and then it'll do the next one. It'll continue on until there's no more that meet that criteria. So that's how we have our flow here. That's the flow in its entirety. So I guess we'll pause again and see if there's any other questions that we have that have came in.
Sure. So we've got one from Stu. Hi, Stu. Glad you're here.
Well, hey, Stu.
So he says, I love the fact that you labeled your specific scores with what they are / what they measure. This way you could change your definition of lead score if you need to over time. A lead score is a loaded term that can mean one thing to one department and another thing to another department. So he has found it's best not to use lead score, but to call it an indicator to do X, Y, Z, so it leads to better adoption of your calculations.
Totally, yeah, and I think Stu, you hit it spot on there. You probably noticed that you saw that we had a department there, and I hit that spot on where we kind of envisioned that we wanted to build this so we could have multiple fields, and each department may have their own field to have their own score, and if we really wanted to, you could have an aggregator between those. But that's a great comment and great idea of kind of the roadmap that we were thinking with this.
Awesome. And again, I think that's all. We had one other question come in from Kristen, and then you immediately answered it for her.
Oh.
So that was good. She wanted to know if a record from the loop could hit multiple decisions if necessary, or what happens if a record can answer yes to more than one of the decisions. And so you did go through both of those.
Exactly, yeah. I'm actually gonna go back to the flow screen here. That way we can kind of look at it all here. Yeah, we have per that point, yeah, we have a couple of those decisions on decisions that are happening there, which make it really, it looks cumbersome, but when you're thinking through it, it makes a lot of sense.
Awesome. I think that is all the questions we have so far.
Well, cool. When I think actually with that, we've updated that record and we've continued on with the journey there. And so we're at the kind of the end of my journey per se. If there's other questions, if you have specific stuff, I have a scratch order that's open if we want to look at anything specifically in there in terms of how does it do X, Y, and Z. I'm happy to kind of pull that up and answer any questions that come up or that are shown there.
Awesome. So we actually have someone who took us up on our Ask Us Anything About Flow.
Ooh.
So Lakeisha has a question. Let's see here. My company wants me to use one field, ticket number, on the object case and populate that field in another object called internal project. Can we do that with Flow?
So let me make sure I'm thinking about this right. So we have the record with a field, and we want to populate that same value on a different object.
Yep.
Yeah. And are those objects related?
So Lakeisha, I think that is a question that we have for you. Is there some sort of relationship between the case and the internal project? I think we'll have to wait for that. Otherwise, I think if the answer is yes, oh, yes. If the internal project is created from a ticket, then it is.
Okay. So then I think as long as they're related, you would be able to, because you can, you should be able to trigger a flow to do a record update on that, or kind of on creation, even if it sounds like that's on upon creation. And then depending upon, I'm trying to think which the parent-child relationship there, you either could cascade down through that record that triggered the flow, or even do a get if you really needed to. But at the end of the day, you'd be able to get through the process to do an update, as long as they're related, and kind of you could set a variable or just reference that value of the record that initially triggered the flow. Did I do that? I'm still a learner on the flow, so I'm not sure if I articulated that very well or not.
Got it. Okay. So she said it's a lookup field. I tried, but the internal project field won't populate. So it may be that if it's a lookup field, it needs the ID of the record. So if you haven't been using the ID and you've been trying to use a name or something else, that might be a little bit of a challenge. So, and Stu chimes in again, we are all still learners of Flow, Nick, and I will be the first to admit I'm still learning things about Flow too. So 100%. So Lakeisha, sounds like that may have answered your question. If not, definitely let us know for sure. Okay, so we have Ying Ying asked us, is it possible to calculate the time, how long for a user to read an email? So if greater than 5, if they read it in less than 5 minutes, add 2 points. If it was more than 5 minutes, add 1 point.
Oh, sure. This is a great question. We're not doing anything with our flow itself, but I'd be interested with that might go back to some of the email analytics that exist in the email platform that you're doing. I can't say for certain if Marketing Cloud can do that, but I wouldn't be surprised if you would be able to have some sort of a way, not just to track if they've clicked or opened it, but if you could get into that level of how long were they open on the page, kind of like how you could do a website page views, how long have they had something open. So I wouldn't be surprised if you could do it. I just don't know if it's the exact way to do that.
Yep, I think it definitely depends on whether or not that information is available in whatever platform you're using. If you can do a calculation of date time open versus date time sent, then you'd be able to figure that out. But it would require that data to exist first.
Exactly. And even some of the stuff, just to mention on that, if you want to get that back, say, to Salesforce for a lead score, the big data consideration and the important thing is how much data are you flowing back in, and the use case for that data. If there's maybe even a way that within your marketing tool, can you do some of those lead score calculations and feed it back into Salesforce? If there's kind of some of those email automation tools that are trying to do analytics over there in a deep way, you do some scoring over there and then feed that score back too.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm not seeing any new questions pop up just yet. So Nick, one question I have for you is, knowing that you're a little bit newer to Flow, how long did it take you to build this?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It was probably a week's worth of time, like, or not like of time itself, but kind of probably you know, we do a lot of kind of week-long sprints here at our org, and so it was kind of a week-long sprint, probably working on and off for a week though, to try to get to the point of actually finessing it to do what I wanted. The um, the flows page where we were the decision tree and the get ended up being where I actually spent a lot of my time, because it was not just learning those tools and how to do those and how to assignments work, but also trying to get the criteria just right, where it would go down and maybe it wouldn't hit the decision just right, and have to go back and make sure that the criteria was working right. So, better portion of a week though as a whole.
Very cool. All right. Stu would like to know, with your Flow, did you worry about scope, reaching limits of data or calculations, and how did you go about architecting or designing or speccing out your work before you got started building it?
Yeah, great question, Stu. In terms of limits and stuff, I think I was most nervous about the limit, the number of records that we would be flowing back from Marketing Cloud to get the emails that were coming back in, and so the clicks and the sends and all that kind of stuff. I actually had picked some battles with the organization to say, we're not going to have that data back in our Salesforce instance. That's too much data point. There were others that had different viewpoints that I think we were able to kind of work through the differences on that one and realize that there was a use case, not just for having that data in there, but there was a use case to have someone as our sales team they actually are looking, if someone clicked on an email, they may or not be calling them up. And so there was a use case for end users to see that data, and a use case for reporting as well, that we can have a centralized reporting. So that's ultimately what won me over to say, yes, let's get that data added in. It's not just to calculate a lead score. So on the scope side, that's where we did a lot of the work in there. In terms of how did I kind of document, or how did I write out this flow? I'm kind of odd in that I didn't actually flowchart it out. I actually used flow as my flowchart. And so I kind of built a skeleton of what I wanted the flow to do, and kind of had that be my documentation, or kind of my whiteboard. And then as I started to think more about it, I was going back in and adding, more decisions, more assignments, more whatever it may be based on there. So flow actually became my whiteboard in terms of how was I documenting it, and took that flow and converted it over to being something that actually could be used.
I probably shouldn't admit this on a recording, but I do much the same thing. So for some odd reason, it just works way better for me to sit and stare at a flow canvas than even to try and do it in Lucidchart or something first.
Exactly. No, there's just something about, because the shapes are all, it's designed as a flowchart, and the shapes are all kind of the same there for almost that reason.
Fantastic. All right. Well, I will do one last call for questions. I think we've gotten through everything that's come in so far. So, but while we're waiting for that, Nick, I do just want to say thank you so much again for coming to present. This is definitely a great use case for Flow, and I was excited to have you walk us through how you built this for your own custom lead scoring.
You bet. Go with the flow. It's always fun to learn something new with flow. So hopefully there's some nuggets out there people were able to pull today for their orgs.
Absolutely. And apparently the Salesforce admin team has started a new hashtag. It's now Flow Friday. So I am going to totally just jump on board that bandwagon, and we're going to wish everyone